Hi, my name is Donagh Berry, and I'm going to talk to you about decision support tools from the cradle to the grave, or in other words, from birth until death. Now, because this is part of the EAAP Gen Tour session, the vast majority of what I'm going to talk about is in relation to what we have developed within the Gen Tour program. And while there are many decisions that must be made every single day on a farm, I will just be focusing again on those that we are actively researching. The talk will be both applicable to dairy and beef cattle, but of course, most of these tools are equally applicable to any other species. It's probably a good thing that this is recorded because it gives you an opportunity to look at the complexity of the decisions that exist on farm when it comes to, for example, breeding. Also, this is only, as I said, a snapshot of some of these particular examples. So what I will be doing here is I'm going to be going through each of these individually. If we start off with the pre-breeding season, so the decisions have to be made about which cows to breed versus which cows to cull, but also, do you breed these animals for a replacement or not? So if we just first focus on ranking animals on genetic superiority, and the vast majority of people will be well familiar with breeding objectives, or what we also call breeding goals, both in dairy and in beef. And I'm giving you some examples from the international literature on this. So a breeding goal can be summarized as just a linear equation summing up A here is the economic value, so that's the change in profit per unit change in the particular trait of interest, and GM represents genetic merit, whether that is estimated breeding value in beef or predicted transmitting ability in dairy. So, as I said, the breeding goal is just a linear sum of the economic value times the genetic merit for a whole series of different traits. Now, more recently, to aid in decision making, what many people have done have collapsed some of those individual traits into subindexes. So for dairy, for example, it would be a subindex on milk production, which would include milk yield, fat yield, and protein yield. Or you could have a subindex on functionality or fertility, which would include measures of fertility and survival. In beef, you could have a subindex on carcass merit, which would include carcass weight, conformation, or fat score. And this just eases the decisions for the end user, where they themselves can actually alter the emphasis on those indexes. And this is the graph from John Cole and Paul Van Raden's talk, is just showing you the diversity of indexes that exist. This is just the relative emphasis on individual traits for dairying across different countries. And of course, the opportunity also exists to generate bespoke indexes, which are unique to individual farmers, their preferences, but also their production systems. Now, for a trait to be included in these decision support tools ranking indexes for breeding, it must fulfill three criteria. Firstly, it must be important, and while traditionally this meant economic importance, more and more now we're talking about social importance. Secondly, it must exhibit genetic variability. And thirdly, the trait must be measurable or correlated with a measurable trait. And you're going to hear a lot more about these individual components in the next few talks from the likes of Yvette, talking on resilience, but also things like feed efficiency. And then finally, the importance within the GenTOR program of being able to generate accurate cross-breed genomic evaluations, which can be plugged in to the breeding goal to ranking these animals on superiority genetically. And these goals are always being updated. This is just giving you an idea of the evolution of the Irish dairy breeding goal called the EBI, or Economic Breeding Index, over the past 20 years, where blue here represents the emphasis on milk production, and red is the emphasis on fertility and survival. So what we can see is an altering of the relative emphasis of these traits, but also the addition of new traits. And that begs the question is what is the future going to hold? Is it going to include traits that Yvette and Co are going to talk about from a resilience or an efficiency perspective, which GenTOR is all about? So again, we talk about ranking on a breeding index or culling on a culling index. And while most people would be familiar with the breeding indexes, probably less familiar would be the culling indexes, which we have developed within Gentor. On the left-hand side, this is a culling index which Mags Kelleher has developed in Ireland for dairy cows, which is now deployed. And on the right-hand side, it has just been accepted for publication, is from FINA on developing an index for ranking beef animals or beef females for culling, but also, of course, for retention. And this is important because we know most traits follow a normal distribution. And traditionally, we would have focused probably on the genetically superior animals and bred from those in the pursuit of altering the mean of that distribution towards the favorable direction. But of course, you can achieve exactly the same by culling the inferior animals. So by combining these two decision support tools, you should be able to achieve faster genetic gain. And just to take a slight diversion here, because this is important, from a performance perspective, we can decompose the phenotype into its environmental effects, its genetic effects, and then some unexplained variability, random noise, or the residual term. So if we think about genetic evaluations, and let's just take a trait that most people would be familiar with, would be milk yield. Milk yield is a function of the parity of the cow, the age, probably in interaction with parity, the heterosis, so is the animal crossbred or not, some sort of a herd year season or contemporary group effect, a genetic effect, and if milk yield is a cross lactations, then a permanent environmental effect, which, as the name suggests, is an environmental effect which is permanent with the animal throughout its life. But because genetics is in the model, it doesn't include that genetic effect, or shouldn't include that genetic effect, and then the residual term. And as breeders, we really just pulled out that genetic effect. We call those EBVs, or estimated breeding values, if we're cattle or sheep people, or PTAs, predicted transmitting abilities, if we're dairy breeders. However, in this culling index, what we actually did was we generated what we called estimated production values, so EPVs, which included the age of the animal, the heterosis effect, the genetic effect as well, and also the permanent environmental effect. So let's just take a quick example. In dairying, for example, a crossbred cow versus a purebred cow. We know heterosis is very strong for traits associated with viability, so longevity, for example. So if we had two animals that had the same additive genetic merit, or the same EBV, the animal that is crossbred, you would expect it to live longer. The scientific literature would tell us that. Yet, it is not reflected in its breeding index, but it does affect its overall performance. And that's why in the construction of our culling indexes, we would have included these estimated production values. I'm not going to go into much detail on these indexes, but I've taken a high-level view of the cow index of dairying. It comprises of three modules. The first is on the current lactation, so what's the expected profit from this cow for the rest of this lactation? So obviously traits like production, health, fertility, maintenance, and management. But then what's her future potential for the future lactations? And really important here is her aptitude or capacity to survive. How many more lactations is she going to live for and express this genetic superiority? And then finally, if you do colour, of course, if you colour in a factory or an abattoir, you will make money back, but then you would have to replace her by the cost of an additional heifer. So by adding those three together, you can generate the cow index for an animal. And just quickly looking at some of the data, some of the validation. So this is where the animal's own data would not have been included in its derivation of its cow index. What I'm showing on the left-hand side is the milk production potential, be it milk yield in blue or fat and protein yield in green and red. And on the bottom axis is cows stratified within herd for the top 20%, average 20%, or the bottom 20%. Very, very clear that as the cow stratum value disimproved, then so did the milk yield, be it milk or solids yield. On the right-hand side then is the calving spread. Now, strict seasonal calving would be really important for her, and we want our cows to calve really tight and early on the in the calving season. Again, what you can see here is the animal stratified for the top 20% in blue for cow index versus the bottom 20% in red. again without their data included in the analysis. Once they express their data, what you can clearly see is that the top 20% of animals on cow, they calve earlier and they calve more tightly. Again, demonstrating the potential benefit of this cow decision support tool for identifying animals who are good performance. The correlation between the cow index and the breeding index is around 0.6 across herds. And this is actually deployed. The cow index is routinely available to Irish dairy farmers for the past few years, where they can go onto their herd profile, look at the rankings of their cows, look at the individual cow index, but also into the three modules that constitute it: the current lactation, the future lactation, and the net replacement cost. Also alongside it, of course, then is the economic breeding index or breeding index itself. Beef, we developed something on the same principles, slightly different. I'm not going to go through the details, but again, looking at the validation within herd, where we would have ranked the animals on the top 25% for this culling index versus the bottom 25% for this culling index. From a fertility perspective on the cow itself, these higher animals or superior animals, they calved earlier, but also, this is the odds ratio, they had a 1.6 times greater odds of surviving to the next lactation compared to the animals in the bottom 25%. If we look at their progeny, then we can see minimal difference in the progeny traits. So what the culling index is really doing is actually selecting for better female performance. Yes, we can see, look at a small improvement in carcass weight and conformation score of the progeny. So back to our big schema again. Let's focus now on, we've identified animals based on our breeding index that are genetically inferior, so we do not want to breed replacements from them, be that dairy replacements or beef replacements, so we will mate them with a terminal beef bull to produce surplus calves. And there are many indexes available. There are indexes in beef to identify beef bulls suitable for producing terminal calves, but now more recently we're also seeing indexes that rank beef bulls for suitability for mating for dairy females. And one example is what we have developed in Ireland, calling it the Dairy Beef Index. And this is just illustrating the emphasis within the Dairy Beef Index and the traits that constitute it. What we can see here is that around 64% of the emphasis in this index that ranks beef bulls for suitability for use on dairy females, around 64% of the emphasis is on calving performance traits. And this really is no surprise. Anybody that knows anything about dairy would know that dairy farmers are really cognizant of the fact that they want the cow to produce a calf with minimal difficulty, get back in calf and produce a lot of milk. And that's why the emphasis is so strong on calving performance. The remainder of that index then would be on carcass traits such as carcass weight, conformation and fat score, docility, and also feed intake, because we would have feed intake measures on beef animals from performance testation data. So now that we have identified our genetically elite animals, we need to determine, well, what type of semen and what type of bull are we going to mate these genetically elite females with? This type of work is more done on dairy, very little if any of such work done on beef animals. But what we want to look at is what is the predicted conception rate of a given animal. If it has a high predicted pregnancy outcome, one might use something like sex semen or expensive semen, while if those cows or females who are likely have a greater likelihood of not becoming pregnant, but because you're in your breeding season, then you might use test bull semen or conventional lower cost semen. And there are many papers published that have attempted to predict the pregnancy outcome of dairy females. This is just taken from one example. This is the receiver operation characteristic curve. The triangles here is based on cross-validation data set, and the squares are based on external validation. The line itself isn't that different to a 45-degree line, which suggests it's not that accurate. It's not that much better than flipping a coin, looking at a cow and just flipping a coin and trying to predict whether you go in calf or not. But this was from one of the pieces of work we've done. We're doing this again in Gentor, and when you stand back from it and think, it really is going to be difficult to predict when a cow is going to go in calf. And just to give you some examples of the noise or the future noise that could appear, because you don't know what a lot of these effects a priori, such as the AI technician. So what AI technician is going to come tomorrow to inseminate the cow? And maybe it's your own AI technician, but you have good days and you have bad days, so there's an interaction with time. Which ejaculate of that bull is going to be used, and also the interactions between the bull and the cow. So, for example, is there a co-ancestry that exists between the bull and the cow? We know there are temporal effects. Weather has a big impact. Temporal effects by herd effects, and also was the cow actually in estrus? And a lot of the technologies that are being developing, like accelerometers, pedometers, etc., they can help us reduce the variability in the last term, and also a bit of knowledge about the technician effects can help us to try to remove some of this noise. But I think it's going to be very, very difficult to accurately predict pregnancy status or pregnancy outcome of individual cows. And maybe this is where our problem lies, as we try to want to predict everything, but maybe we need to stand back and say, well, rather than predicting everything or put a prediction on everything, why not just try to publish or predict values that we're more confident on? So this is just taken from the Hempstock paper, where 72% of the inseminations in the cows that were the top 5% on predicted likelihood of conception, they actually resulted in a successful conception. So what we could do by combining all the decision support tools, we would know if the farmer, for example, is using sex semen, how many heifers she or he would need to go in calf to produce replacements, and then work our way back as to what are the likely candidates who should conceive to more expensive semen. And once you have identified those animals, then the next question is, well, what sire do I use on those? And although there's good information here from a dairy perspective on sire advice systems, there's less so in beef. And when developing these decision support tools for sire advice, there are many considerations. So the firstly would be genetic complementarity. For example, if you had a cow who had poor carcass conformation and good carcass weight, then you might want to do assortative mating to correct for those deficiencies. Also, from a major genes perspective, like calving difficulty, if you have a cow who is carrying, for example, the NT821 deletion in the myostatin, which predisposes it to more calving difficulty, then one might want to be careful about the NT821 variant that the bull is actually carrying. Co-ancestry, strong co-ancestry will result in inbreeding. You want to avoid that from a pure breeding perspective, but not an issue if you're using a beef bull on a dairy female. Also, you want to be consider the female phenotypic features of what I talk about here. For example, if the female is a heifer, a young cow, or a small heifer, then you wouldn't want to be using a bull who has pretty strong calving difficulty. And then finally, and just raise your attention to Chris Hose's paper on session 41, a Gentor paper on Thursday, which is looking at heterogeneity or the homogeneity of the progeny. And traditionally, as breeders, we would have focused on improving the mean of the population. But, and I don't want to steal Chris's thunder here, but maybe we should also be considering the heterogeneity or the likely heterogeneity of those progeny. So me, for example, being a beef farmer, I would actually take the risk of using a bull who is slightly more calving difficulty from a genetic perspective, but has a smaller distribution. So there's a less of a chance that bull is going to throw extremely large calves. Then moving quickly on, once the calf is produced, we need to decide, well, are we going to keep this calf as a female, graduate to the herd, or will we actually, is this calf surplus to requirements and we can either sell it on or we can slaughter the animal. So that then becomes the importance of genotype. So there is a paper on the on-farm net benefit of genotyping females. It is sufficiently generic to be applicable to both dairy, beef, and sheep. And on the right-hand side, top right, I'm showing you the Excel file. You can just email me or Joe Newton for that Excel file. It's freely available. The model inputs you require are listed here. So what proportion of females will be kept as replacements? What is the replacement rate? What is the genomic reliability that you'll get? The SAR parentage error? What's the current traditional reliabilities that you get for the different traits or for the index, and what is its heritability? And then what is the current cost of genotyping females and the standard deviation of that index? So really simple parameters that are required for input. It's, as I said, it's pretty simple. It's Excel based, and the model outputs that you get from running it is what is the net benefit of genotyping on a per female per lifetime basis. That takes cognizant of the genomic test cost that has been inputted. Now, with a bit of simple algebra, the other output that you can get then is what's the break-even cost of genotyping. So in other words, it would say to you, well, if the break-even cost of genotyping is 36 euros in dairying, then if your cost of genotyping is less than that, then it is more profitable. And although the numbers themselves are kind of largely irrelevant because it's purely a function of the population parameters, but if you just take Ireland, for example, our average parameters, average herd size, etc. In dairying, the cost benefit or the return on investment of genotyping is worth over 4,500 euros per dairy farmer, while in beef it's 899 euros. So again, an easy to use, which can easily be deployed in any web service to determine what is the cost benefit of genotyping for each individual farm. And then as we near towards the end, we have the surplus calves. And although from a dairy perspective, no animals would be moving from surplus calves into the mature herd, but if you think about it from a dairy beef, there are many beef cows that will actually be F1, so first cross dairy versus beef. They could have arisen from the genetically inferior dairy cows mated to a beef bull, produced a dairy beef F1 female. When you genotype it, is suitable for graduation to the mature herd. So what you're trying to decide here is, well, my F1 dairy crossbreds, should I slaughter them or should I retain them as females? So the first one is what we call the beef own worth, and you can see the reference there. And the second one is the beef female's profit potential. I've actually already discussed that one. That's the cow index from the beef perspective. But why I want to show the two of them together is that you can compare the return from the BOW of this calf versus the BFPP. So it enables you then to make a decision: is should the animal go into graduation to a beef herd, or should I try to sell this animal for If we just focus on the beef own worth again, it's exactly the same principle as the culling indexes for dairy and beef. We don't just consider the estimated breeding value, we consider the estimated production value. So it includes the gender of the animal, because obviously in most cases a male calf would be more worth than a female, the twinning and other non-genetic effects. The traits that we considered are 5 traits in total, and these are all clearly described in the paper. So the carcass credentials, be it carcass weight, number 1, the 2 and 3 is conformation of fat score, feed intake, and then docility. And if we just look at the BOW in practice, so this is data from 2019, Irish data, very limited. It's just for calves that were sold at livestock auctions where the BOW value of these animals wasn't available at the time. We see the BOW on the bottom, and we see the price actually paid on the vertical axis. So there's a decent relationship there. Now, if you're a pure statistician, you'd say, oh, that's not very much strong of a relation. But anybody who knows anything about cattle would, and the variability that exists on any given day, the price that will be paid, would say that that's a pretty good relationship. And in the COVID environment, you can see how this could be really, really useful. So just to conclude, the tools that we have developed here, I would argue, have a modular framework potential, so that you can plug in and plug out new traits that we're going to hear about for the rest of this session. It's based on selection index theory. There are many other ways we could do this using artificial intelligence, machine learning, etc. But farmers are familiar with this selection index theory. As I said, it currently exploits available data sources. It can easily be augmented with additional data sources, but I like to always focus on what I call phenotypes, which are phenotypes that are free. Also, there's cross-compliance across the tools. So the dairy beef index feeds into the transaction index. And then finally, there is the potential to use herd blues to make these more bespoke. So the expected response to selection can differ by farm. Thank you.